What if I told you the International Space Station, one of humanity's most iconic scientific achievements, was never really just about science? Because when most people think about the ISS, they imagine astronauts floating around, cool experiments in zero gravity, maybe a symbol of international cooperation, a giant orbital laboratory where humanity put aside politics and worked together. But that story is only half true. The other half is a lot more interesting, because the ISS is also a political object. It was born out of rivalry, shaped by governments, locked into international power structures, and even its physical design reflects political decisions. So the real question is not just what the ISS is, it is how political is a machine like this really? And to answer that, we need to go beyond the usual spaces inspiring narrative and look at the ISS the way a political theorist would. Because once you do that, the station stops looking like a neutral space lab and starts looking like a monument to power, compromise, strategy, and control. The ISS was never just science. How the International Space Station became political. Section 1. Setup. Before we get into the ISS specifically, we need one key idea. A political theorist named Langdon Winner asked a really strange question back in 1980. Do artifacts have politics? At first, that sounds weird. A bridge is a bridge, a machine is a machine. A space station is just hardware in orbit, right? But Winner's argument is that technologies are not always neutral. Sometimes politics get built into them, and he basically gives us two ways that can happen. The first is when a technology is politicized through use. In other words, the object itself is not inherently political, but people use it in ways that create power, exclusion, or control. The second is more radical. Some technologies are political by design. Their structure, their function, their conditions for existing, all of that already ties them to certain systems of authority and governments. That distinction matters a lot here, because the ISS is not just some random tool that politicians happen to use. The deeper you look, the more it starts to resemble a technology that was political from the beginning. Not because science on board is fake, not because research does not matter, but because the station only exists through massive state power, international agreements, strategic coordination, and geopolitical compromise. That already tells you this is not a neutral gadget. And that idea is basically the backbone of this entire video. The ISS is not just used politically, it is deeply political in its foundations. Section 2. Space stations were never born in a vacuum. Now, to understand why the ISS ended up like this, you have to go back to before the ISS even existed, because space stations did not emerge in some peaceful, idealistic scientific bubble. They came out of a space race. And the space race was not just about discovery, it was about prestige, it was about military potential, it was about proving technological superiority. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union both rushed to absorb German rocket expertise. Then came the Cold War. Then came Sputnik in 1957, then Yuri Gagarin in 1961. And suddenly, space was no longer just a frontier, it was a geopolitical arena. That matters because the logic of the space race shaped the DNA of later orbital projects. Space stations were not imagined only as peaceful research environments. They were also tied to reconnaissance, state capability, military implications, and long-term strategic positioning. Even when people talked about scientific uses, the political layer was always there. So when the ISS eventually appeared, it did not come out of nowhere. It inherited all that history. It inherited a world in which access to orbit was expensive, dangerous, and overwhelmingly state-controlled. And that already pushes us towards Winner's point. Technologies reflect the societies and power structures that produce them. The ISS is not outside politics. It's the child of politics. Section 3. The ISS was not built primarily because scientists demanded it. This is where the story really gets interesting. The International Space Station did not begin as the ISS. Originally, the United States was working on a project called Space Station Freedom that was supposed to be an American-led station. Later, it evolved into a broader Western project involving Europe, Japan, Canada, and then, after the Cold War, Russia was brought in too. And that part is crucial, because according to various sources, The station was not originally driven mainly by scientific demand. In fact, the American scientific community often preferred cheaper unmanned alternatives. So why go forward with something this huge, this expensive, and this politically complicated? Because the station served political, economic, and industrial purposes. It helped preserve relationships. It helped organize major state-backed aerospace efforts. It created a framework for cooperation. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, bringing Russia into the project also had a stabilizing function. It was a way to integrate a former rival into a shared system instead of letting competition escalate again. The ISS was presented publicly as a research platform, and yes, it absolutely became one, but underneath that public image sat another logic: strategic alignment. In other words, the station was also a peace project, a control project, an industrial project, and a geopolitical project. That is why calling it just a science lab misses the real story. The science is there, but the architecture of cooperation around it was political from day one. Section 4. Even the structure of the ISS is political. Now here's the part that I find most fascinating. The politics of the ISS are not only in its history, they are in its structure. The station is modular. Different countries are responsible for different components. The United States and Russia, because of their greater capabilities, were responsible for the main structural and service elements. Other partners contributed their own modules, technologies, and responsibilities. That sounds like efficient engineering, but it is also a division of power. Who builds the core? Who maintains which systems? Who controls transport? Who has the leverage if something goes wrong? Who depends on whom? Those are technical questions, yes, but they are also political questions. And the clearest example is something that sounds boring until you realize how important it is: docking systems. If spacecraft from different countries cannot physically connect to the same station, then cooperation has limits. Compatibility becomes power, standards become influence. That means the design of an interface, literally the place where one machine connects to another, can shape international relationships. That is why the development of the International Docking System Standard, or IDSS, matters so much. Officially, it was about interoperability and safety, but politically, it was also about setting the rules of access. Whoever defines the standard helps define the system. That is classic politics hidden inside hardware. And this is exactly where this argument is strongest. It shows that a technical object like an airlock or docking port is not politically innocent. It can decide who integrates smoothly, who depends on custom solutions, and who sits outside the main network. Section 5. Dependence reveals the real power of relationships. Then things got even messier. In 2011, the United States retired their space shuttle, and that created a huge problem, because for a while, NASA basically lost its own domestic way of sending astronauts to the ISS. So what happened? It had to buy seats on Russian Soyuz spacecraft. Think about that. The leading space power in the world, one of the main architects of the ISS, suddenly depended on Russia to access the station. That completely changed the power dynamic. Now, instead of a clean narrative of equal collaboration, you had a situation where one partner had a temporary monopoly over human transport to orbit. And once monopoly enters the conversation, politics get sharper. Prices went up, tensions rose. And this all happened in a context where US-Russia relations were already worsening, especially after Crimea. So the ISS kept operating, but the cooperation was no longer sitting on some pure apolitical foundation. It was sitting on strategic necessity. This is the real pattern here. The ISS often looks most cooperative exactly when it is also most dependent. And dependence is never neutral. Dependence creates leverage. So again, the station is not just a floating lab. It is a network of negotiated vulnerabilities. Section 6. The end of the ISS era says a lot. Now fast forward to the present phase of the ISS story. The station is aging. Some of its main modules are old. New commercial stations are being developed. NASA has openly discussed the transition beyond the ISS era. Despite this, calling the ISS obsolete does not tell the whole story, because this is not just about aging hardware. It is also about the breakdown of a political model that made the ISS possible in the first place. The old ISS formula depended on a level of collaboration between major space actors that just does not exist in the same way anymore. Russia and the West are deeply divided. China has become a major space power, but was never truly integrated into the ISS framework. The United States is increasingly focused on a new strategic direction for the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords, which create a different coalition structure for the future of space exploration. That is a big shift. The ISS represented one kind of world order, costly cooperation among major powers in low Earth orbit. The next era looks different, more commercial, more fragmented, more competitive, more block-based. So in a weird way, the end of the ISS also proves this argument. Because if the station had been purely scientific, then science alone should have been enough to carry its collaborative spirit forward. But it was never just scientific. It was built on a political order, and when that order is weakened, the station's historical role is weakened with it. Section 7. So what is the ISS really? So where does that leave us? Well, according to Winner's framework, the ISS is not easy to classify neatly. It is clearly political by design. It depends on governments, treaties, funding systems, strategic partnerships, and specific international power arrangements. At the same time, it is not locked into one single use. It has flexibility, it supports research, diplomacy, symbolism, engineering, and even commercial transitions. So maybe the best way to describe it is this. The ISS is a hybrid political technology. It is inherently political in the conditions that created it and sustained it, but it is also flexible enough to serve multiple purposes, which is why so many people still see it mainly as a research platform. And honestly, that tension is what made it such a fascinating case study, because the ISS shows us something bigger than just space policy. It shows us that technology is never just metal, code, and function. Technology carries the fingerprints of the world that built it, its alliances, its fears, its ambitions, its compromises. And when you look at the International Space Station through that lens, it stops being just a triumph of science. It becomes a mirror of international politics in orbit. So the next time you see footage of the ISS drifting silently above Earth, remember, you are not just looking at a laboratory. You are looking at the remains of a Cold War, the machinery of international diplomacy, the logic of state power, and one of the clearest examples of how politics can be built directly into technology. And that might be the most important thing the ISS teaches us. Not just how to live in space, but how impossible it is to escape politics, even there.